Hello, you are listening to Radio Maria, and this is Just Life, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Father Conor McDonough, who's over here in England. He's a Dominican and priest of the Irish province, and he's going to be giving a lecture this evening on how to be an atheist according to St. Thomas Aquinas. So if you're in London and that topic intrigues you, come along to Farm Street this evening. But a very warm welcome to you, Father Conor.
Thanks very much, Father Toby. It's great to be here.
And it's a real pleasure for me to have you here, even in just doing a bit of preparation for this conversation. I know that we have more than enough material to go with now, but just tell our listeners a little bit about yourself to start off with, and how you came into the order and what you're up to now.
Yeah, so I mean, people might be able to hear I'm not a Londoner. I'm from Ireland, from Galway in the west of Ireland, but I studied in England in Cambridge. And taught up in Yorkshire for 2 years before I joined the Dominicans, and so getting to know the Dominicans in Cambridge, actually that was quite important in my own vocational journey. So the English province played a role in my journey to the Irish province of Dominicans. I entered in 2009. I did all my studies in Ireland and then in Switzerland, and I've been based in Dublin since then until September, when I was reassigned to Galway, where I'm doing a PhD studying early Irish Christianity at the University of Galway. So that's where I am now, as well as lots of other different bits and pieces. So you know yourself, Father Toby, that as Dominicans we get called to speak in many different places, and we've a lot of ephemeral contact with a very wide range of people, whereas diocesan priests would have much maybe more long-term contact with a smaller group of people. So that's the kind of work that I'm involved with, as well as my studies. And
what we're going to talk about today, you gave me a nice segue in there, because we were going to speak a little bit about some of the trends going on with Gen Z and the encounter with Jordan Peterson. And I was thinking, you were saying there sort of like almost English Dominicans were your gateway drug to the Irish Dominicans.
I ascended.
And we're going to speak a little bit about the way that Jordan Peterson leads some people into an encounter with the living God, yes. and also how some people don't get sort of further than just the Jordan Peterson videos, and why that might be. But you were at a sort of conference out in Cologne recently, Seek, and tell us about that. Who was there and what you were doing there?
Yeah, so Seek is a conference that's organised by Focus, which is the Fellowship of Catholic University Students. For the past, I think, about 20 years or so, they've been growing in their presence on American campuses and also in Ireland and now in continental Europe. And they're kind of an outreach organisation, so they train students to be missionaries on campus, and they have full-time student missionaries on various different campuses. They came to Ireland about 10 years ago to University College Dublin. I was sceptical at the start, I have to say. I was thinking this is going to be too American an approach. It's not going to work well in Ireland. But it has just been amazing to see their approach, which is very much based on small group, friendship with small groups, small group Bible study, how that accompanying of students who are very often unchurched or kind of moving away from the church, how that has borne immense fruit in University College Dublin, in Cork now where they are as well, and in Queen's University Belfast. So these conferences, these Seek conferences, they happen normally in the States, and usually you'll get students from all over the world who'll attend them. Sometimes it's up to 20,000 people attend these conferences. It's often a life-changing experience for the people who go. But this was the first time they had it in continental Europe. So instead of Irish students going over to America, they were slightly disappointed that they wouldn't be going to America. Instead they were going to Cologne. But it was an extraordinary thing, because the European context is slightly different from America, so there was less of a gap between, let's say, where the German church is and where the Irish church is. And we were able also to have Mass in the in Cologne Cathedral every single day, which was utterly mind-blowing. But there's about 500 students there from all around Europe. I was all English speaking. 150 students came from Irish campuses, which again blew my mind. And I enjoy speaking to academics at Irish universities who may or may not have faith, and just letting them know that a lot of their students are actually rediscovering Christ and rediscovering the life of the church. So many of those young people are people who were not brought up practicing, or if they were very much at risk of falling away. And here they are on fire in their Christmas holidays, listening to these many talks and worshipping together, going to the sacraments. It was really extraordinary to see, and they're normal young people. It's not as if they're at the fringes of their campus life. They're utterly mainstream and yet utterly in love with the Lord.
Yeah, it's fascinating to say that. I was thinking of a conversation I had recently with a young man who's interested in religious life or priesthood. And he was telling me a little bit about his story and said that he started to get this sense of the Spirit moving within him and calling to the priesthood. So he went to his local parish priest and thought, I'll tell Father that I'm thinking about becoming a priest. And then he said to me, the kicker was, the priest said to me, "That's great, but don't you think you should start coming to Mass?"
Wow.
And he was like, "Oh, that's probably a good point." And so here was this guy being completely evangelized outside of the context of the church.
Totally.
He's not being evangelized in his family. He's not going to Mass. And yet there is stuff in the content, largely online, that he's encountering, which is moving him towards thinking that he might have a vocation to serve God as a priest. And I think one thing I know both of us wanted to state first up, that with focus and with all the things that we're going to talk about, we're not saying if you do X, then Y will happen. That if only you got these structures right, then your church will be full of young people on fire with the Lord. But rather what we can do is we can see what seems to be working in one place and say, this seems to provide good soil. This seems to make people sort of more with a larger, greater disposition to receiving the Holy Spirit. But ultimately, it's the Holy Spirit that converts, not us. So none of what we're going to say is an idea of like this is a global panacea that will fix everything.
But just on that, I think that what Paul VI said, he said the Holy Spirit is the primary agent of evangelization. We've got to keep returning to that, but we've also got to be careful students of the culture around us and be really attentive to the trends that are developing, so that openings that emerge, we can take those opportunities rather than being asleep.
Yeah, and one of those trends that Paul VI observed was that ours is an age that responds to witness rather than teachers. And so many of the ways in which we've sought to sort of teach Christianity seem to belong to a past age, or not as effective. And I don't know if you've read the book From Christendom to Apostolic Mission.
No, but I've heard Hannah von Struess, who might be known to your speaker. She kind of presented on that book, and it was really, really interesting about the saltwater and the freshwater fish. And so on.
I think he's got some really interesting points to make. But one of the points that he makes in the book is, unlike some of these other church programs, he says, I'm not going to say to you, like, this is exactly what you need to do. He said, you need to read the signs of the times. You need to be aware of what's going on. But what is it that you see going on in the university campuses now? Like you were telling me about really quite encouraging numbers coming to the Thomistic Institute and to focus events in Ireland. How are they getting there, and what's their relationship with the I hate the word, but people know what I mean by the institutional church.
So I mean, because you mentioned the Thomistic Institute there, this is another kind of on-campus phenomenon apart from Focus. And for example, in Trinity College Dublin, they don't have the presence of Focus, but they have the Thomistic Institute, which organises monthly lectures. And I saw that grow steadily over time. So initially there might have been kind of 10 students attending these lectures. I gave a talk there, and there was about 100 there, which is utterly incredible. And when Father Gregory Pine was giving a talk there was about 200 in the lecture theatre. And many of these are, as I said, mainstream students who are curious or kind of making a journey back to the faith. They're at some stage on that journey. Or they're actively sceptical, but at least they're coming along to something that that's exposing them to the truths of the Catholic faith. So those things, that kind of growth I would never have predicted, and it goes very much against our general sense of decline. And it's important not to be hyper optimistic and to recognise that there is enormous decline. There's huge indifference to the spiritual life, huge indifference to the gospel in our times. That's very much a reality. But at the same time, and kind of statistics bear this out in various different surveys in Britain and America and elsewhere, that Gen Z, or Gen Z as you proud Britain, you had to call it Gen Z. I call it Gen Z. We're kind of further to the west, closer to America. But Gen Z seem to be, in fact, far less atheistic, far more into the spiritual life and interested in spiritual values than millennials and so on, and then older generations. And even that Gen Z, they seem to be far more critical of the mainstream secular vision of life, in ways that we just simply wouldn't have predicted. So I see that on campus in a far greater openness to the gospel, a far greater interest in the Christian kind of understanding of life and the intellectual riches of Catholicism that wasn't there in my generation. And it's quite surprising to see it appear in a younger generation. Surprising in some ways, but perhaps not in others. We know, as Catholics, that there is a great deal lacking in the mainstream secular vision of life. And so we shouldn't be surprised when people aren't satisfied by it and are looking for something more. And I think that's exactly what we see on campuses now.
Yeah. One of the things that I thought is that young people now, and there is a real mental health crisis going on amongst young people, and they're aware of this. Like, there are some situations where I go and I'm speaking to young people, and I don't want to sound like the boring old fart who says, these are your problems.
Yeah.
You don't know that these are your problems, but these are your problems.
Yeah.
But with young people now, they are conscious
Very much.
that their mental health is bad.
Very much.
And they don't really quite know what to do about it.
Yeah.
But I think one of the problems, it seems to me, is that the freedom that was supposed to liberate them, which was freedom from any form of authority, actually proved to be an unbearable burden.
Yeah.
This need to completely find my own meaning in every aspect of my life.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to say about Jen. I'm gonna go with you. I'm going to call it Gen Z.
Well,
I'm coming over to the dark side. Otherwise, I don't want us to sound like we're in a pronunciation battle. You have to concede the rest of English pronunciation to me, but I'll let you have Z. And I first came across sort of Generations reading sort of Gen Twench, which we were having a laugh off there because you thought this was another generation that I was talking about. But this is the name of a lady who writes books on the generational shifts. But Gen Z are sort of born mid to late 1990s and early 2010s as when they were born. They're the first generation to have grown up with access to the internet, and I think more importantly, like portable digital technology, i.e. like smartphones. They're dubbed digital natives, and I think they come with, I'm going to say but there are particular sort of avenues through which they become easier to evangelize, and then other obstacles to evangelization, as there are with all generations. But I take the idea of generations quite seriously, because it seems just to be true to me when I sort of read characteristics of generations to other people. They seem to relate to them. But one of the things that Jen Twenge says, unlike some other sociologists who believe in generational shifts, is that she says that these are driven not so much by world events, but by culture, by cultural changes, and that culture is largely driven by technological change. And so she very much identifies the different generations as the sort of the advent of some new form of media or technology which dominates their lives. And we can very obviously see that we're comparing our experience of being at university to the contemporary experience, and phones were just for phone calls and text messages, and still weren't actually the main way that you arranged to meet up or with your friends. You just tended to gather in places and then worked out what you were going to do next from there, which was normally go to the college bar. Another feature of Gen Z is that they drink far less than the previous generations. But I'm interested to hear from you. What are Gen Z sort of watching, and what are they listening to? At least the ones who end up coming to the sort of events where they end up encountering a Dominican friar. Well, and I think what you say is really interesting, and I think maybe a slight
just comment on that question of technology and generational difference, that we probably growing up still had a certain sense of authority in relation to the truth. Even when I was exploring my faith online in those early days, the way I would do it was through EWTN. They had a website where you could address questions to somebody who had a doctorate in theology, and they would reply to you on the Friday. And that was a wonderful thing. And I've actually reconnected with the man who answered my questions when I was a teenager, my serious doubts. But there was a sense of even a kind of a certain structure of authority in the early days of the internet. It was still there, whereas Gen Z are kind of more in this kind of amorphous post-truth thing where there's just a wild range of claims out there, even about, there's a whole load of young people who think that the Roman Empire never existed and that it was all a conspiracy. So there's all these...
Even if they do think about it every day.
They think about it every day, it never existed. So it's kind of a wild range of truth claims out there, so much so that, there is the sense of kind of post-truth. And there's a yearning then for something solid. G.K. Chesterton said it well, that the purpose of an open mind is the same as the purpose of an open mouth, to close it again on something solid. And I think that's what we find in young people in this sea of post-truth comment and discourse. They're yearning for something solid on which to kind of, something solid to grasp. And they're yearning for authorities that they can rely on and so on. In any case, with the Gen Z people who end up encountering a Dominican friar, if it's a voluntary thing, I go into secondary schools as well, and I might talk about that in a moment. But if it's a voluntary thing, they'll often have had their first encounter with, let's say, the life of the church in a way that was compelling to them or interesting to them or kind of grabbed them, was often on something like TikTok. So I regularly meet young people, maybe especially young men, but certainly young people generally, who come across, let's say, a preacher on TikTok, or they might find a Bible video appears, and it's just intriguing to them the way it's presented. And they'll follow the account, and it's not necessarily a Catholic account and so on. Could be evangelical, could be Eastern Orthodox or something like that. But that they will follow the account, and more they will find something here that they find challenging. They find it calls them to a certain discipline, which they appreciate. They find stories here which give a certain meaning and purpose to their life. They find themselves called. We could think of Pope Benedict's line about being called to greatness rather than being called to comfort. The world around them had been calling them to comfort, and suddenly they find something here that is calling them to greatness, that reminds them that they have an immortal soul, and that they have this great dignity, that their actions, their tiniest decisions really matter. And so they often have this sense of just an elevated dignity, their own dignity, and so they come along to events. They're curious. They're looking for community then, and that's, I think, where things should go. So you mentioned the guy who was discerning the priesthood but without going to mass, and that's certainly a risk, that people kind of their faith journey just remains an online phenomenon, and really what we would want, I think, and this is the challenge for the church, is to be ready to receive people who have had some kind of encounter with the gospel online, but then to receive them into living communities where they will meet people that they might disagree with, but that they can pray with and so on. That's so strongly emphasized in the New Testament. You think of the letter to the Hebrews, do not stay away from the weekly meetings. There's something about the in the flesh encounter, in the flesh community life, which is so important. The corporal works of mercy, the spiritual works of mercy. You can't do all that online. Okay, you can correct error, and people are often more than happy to do that on Discord or Reddit or wherever. But in any case, they that's how I see it happening, and I see real personal conversion happening through these online things. I mentioned Discord. I met a young man a good number of months ago, and he was coming to confession, and just serious man, really serious about his spiritual life. And I just asked him, where this all emerged, and he said it was on Discord, which is kind of a server that kind of gamers use to talk about the video games they're playing. But also there are little Catholic corners of Discord, and all his intellectual and spiritual formation was happening there. So that's, I think, where I see things happening. They're listening to podcasts, and it might not even be Christian podcasts, but something like Joe Rogan, somebody like Jordan Peterson, these kind of gateways that lead them to question the mainstream view of life, and then to be interested in alternative views, including Christianity.
Yeah. So you were saying about using EWTN as a young man and characterizing that as looking for the truth, looking for answers about these things. Do the young people that you're encountering speak of their search in terms of truth, or is it more the search for meaning or for community? Because I think that matters, because something like, I think Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, but you can kind of encounter him looking for a way, looking for life, looking for truth, and it strikes me, but I'm not completely sure, that sometimes if, as the Dominican order, very proud of our sort of motto of veritas, that if we say we're all about truth, well, some young people don't actually know whether truth is really a thing, or they don't understand it in the same way as we do. But I'm interested how the young people sort of characterize their search, if they do characterize it under sort of searching for a particular thing.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because I think they often characterize it negatively in my conversations with them. So it's not that they're saying I'm looking for truth or I'm looking for meaning, but more that, let's say, during COVID I was really dissatisfied, my life wasn't going anywhere, and then I started exploring these things. So there, I mean, you could say that it's more to do with kind of truth in a lived context, which we might call meaning, by the sounds of that. But having said that, I was listening to Johannes Hartl recently. He was a really interesting German evangelist. He was on the Godsplaining podcast, and it was put to him that, beauty is far more attractive to people than truth in our time. And he gently pushed back against that, and he said that actually among Gen Z, he finds, because they're kind of swimming in this post-truth environment, truth is actually really intoxicating to them. The idea of it, and then actually encountering it, finding something that isn't just kind of a tissue of lies. And if we think again of, let's say young Father Karol Wojtyła in communist Poland, how he would just draw young people away from mainstream society. He'd bring them hiking, he'd bring them on canoeing trips. They would sit around the campfire, they would read C.S. Lewis, for example, and that there they would encounter truth away from the society of lies. And I think that element of seeking truth, or at least encountering truth, even if it's not what they're seeking, that's a big part of their stories as well.
And let's get on to Jordan Peterson a little bit then. My first hearing of Jordan Peterson, which was quite an interesting circumstance, I was walking back to the Priory in London one night, and I was still, I think I was a deacon at that point, so we were talking about 7 years ago, and I was going through Camden, and there was a young lady in a pretty bad way, and somehow I can't quite remember how, but me and a young Canadian guy, we ended up putting this lady in a cab home, because we were worried about the situation, that she was just like standing there on the street and something was bad going to happen to her. And then we started to walk off in the same direction, and this young Canadian man said to me, like, what are you? And I explained to him what I am, and then he said to me, have you heard of Jordan Peterson? And I said that I hadn't. And he said to me, I've been watching a lot of him on YouTube. He's got these really interesting videos on the Old Testament, and I find him fascinating. I'm spending hours watching him, and I don't think I then looked up Jordan Peterson. I didn't remember to, but he really came on my radar when he did the sort of interview on Channel 4, which I think that really sort of catapulted him into the larger sort of public attention, at least in England, where he conducted himself brilliantly in this interview, and it went very bad for the very aggressive Channel 4 interview. But when did he first come on your radar, and how are young people encountering that, and is he still a big deal?
Yes, I think it was when he had his first major controversy around his refusal to be compelled by Canadian law, his desire not to be compelled by Canadian law to use the pronouns that people wanted him to use, and so on. I think that was when I first came across him. So I mean, he kind of rose to prominence there during this dispute around the whole transgender phenomenon. But really, he had been working very hard for many years before that. I think that's worth noting about him, is that he was a really interesting psychologist who had done lots of research, done all the hard work, was passionate about Bible stories and about other kinds of stories, maps for meaning, long before that controversy.
Yeah.
And I think
and it's important to say on that for people who aren't aware of that controversy with him, it was not about his refusing to call somebody who's transgender by their preferred pronouns. It was about the state mandating that he must use those pronouns.
Exactly.
And because of his interest in psychology and his sort of horror at what Nazism had made possible, he had a particular interest and fear of what happens when the state takes control of language.
Absolutely.
Because language controls our ability to think.
Yep.
And that's what horrifies him. So he kind of got dragged into the transgender thing, but that wasn't where his big issue was at.
No.
His issue is that the state mandating the language that citizens can use.
No, that's important to underline. So exactly, I kind of started watching some of those videos, 12 rules for life as well. That made a massive splash. And a lot of young men at that stage, I think, were reading that book and were finding there somebody who was really honest about the reality of life, really upfront about the reality of suffering, about the limitations that every human life has to face. And this was really refreshing to them, because I think a lot of these young men felt that they were being kind of sold a Disney-fied version of life, which was just not true, not satisfying. And when you find that it's not true, you kind of spiral off into despair. Whereas Jordan Peterson was saying, this is the reality of life. This is how grim it can be, and nevertheless, it's possible to find meaning to live a meaningful life in that context. And here are some disciplines that can help with that. So it's that he's, on the one hand, he's questioning the mainstream worldview, and on the other hand, he's proposing certain elements of a way of life, and a kind of a demanding way of life. So I think that was very attractive to young men. I'd say in more recent times, I think it's worth underlining this as well, that he says he's been saying all kinds of things in recent years that I would absolutely not get behind. I still listen to him and I still find him an interesting voice, but I prefer his earlier albums.
which is things people of our generation say all the time. I preferred their early stuff.
Their earlier stuff. No, and I think that's the case there. So do young people today listen to a lot of Jordan Peterson? At the moment, I'm not so sure. Certainly a few years ago, it was the case, so much so that some of the missionaries that I mentioned in University College Dublin, they referred to Jordan Peterson as JP3, and they found him like a John the Baptist figure who is somehow critical of society, critical of kind of ideology, and a certain blindness to truth, or a certain lack of curiosity about truth. He's critical of all of that. He's kind of prophetic voice in that sense, and in some sense he's opening up a way which he himself hasn't necessarily taken personally, but a way towards kind of a relationship to God and discipleship of Christ and so on, which many young people have taken.
Yeah, a point might return to, depending on how things goes, the interesting question of would it, obviously we should pray that Jordan Peterson becomes Catholic for the sake of his soul. There's a bigger question, which is it more useful is the Holy Spirit using Jordan Peterson whilst he's outside of the Catholic Church, because that's more effective for bringing people to the Catholic Church. He can't just be dismissed. Well, you're Catholic, of course you'd say that. In the same way that some people say, in God's providence, allowed C.S. Lewis to remain outside the Catholic Church, because he would then bring so many more evangelicals into an encounter with Catholicism. But where I wanted to go next was, Pope Francis said to us as priests recently, I think, that we should preach for no more than 8 minutes, and I think many of our congregation would agree. But I think Jordan Peterson showed in some ways that the problem wasn't preaching for too long. The problem was being really boring.
Yeah,
and he was perhaps the first person to show that amongst young people, if you were interesting.
Yeah,
and if you spoke to the real concerns of their life and deep questions of life, that there was a real appetite for this stuff, and people would be prepared to listen to multiple hour long lectures on the Old Testament, on things which your average priest wouldn't even sort of look at, like always going to the gospel, ignoring the Old Testament. And he showed there was this great sort of appetite for things. And then we mentioned very briefly sort of Joe Rogan. And who would have predicted 10 years ago that one of the most influential figures in all the culture would be a former MMA fighter who is doing like 3-4 hour long podcasts?
Yeah, it's wild. It's absolutely wild. I think with Jordan Peterson, I'd say it's not just that he's trying. I think what's important about him is that he wasn't trying to be relevant, or he wasn't trying to speak the language of young people. He wasn't patronising to them, and I think many young people appreciate that. That he's kind of calling them to live this life that every generation before them has led. There's something perennial that he's trying to communicate. He's drawing on all these old stories, whether it's the Epic of Gilgamesh or the life of Buddha or Exodus. He's drawing on all these kind of stories. These maps for meaning, as he calls them, and he's not trying desperately hard to be appealing to his audience, and he can be. I just think that's very, very striking. But he's profoundly honest. At least in that early phase, he's profoundly honest with them about the realities of life and so on. And you get the sense that he has faced the reality of life, that he's not selling you a product. Again, in that early phase, you get the sense that this is a man who is passionate about these questions, passionate about this research, and passionate about helping people. And I think young people felt that, and really that explains his popularity to a large extent. With Joe Rogan, I think you're more also kind of in the realm of entertainment, and there's kind of a chaos in his podcasts. He just kind of goes in every direction. He'll be talking about some archaeological dig, and then he'll say, surely aliens built this, and then it goes on to aliens for 20 minutes and so on. So when I go into secondary schools, often young people will ask me if I listen to Joe Rogan, and then they'll ask me if I believe in aliens and if I believe in this, that or the other. So he's slightly different, but when young people listen to him, and in my experience it's almost exclusively young men who are listening to him, but teenagers, absolutely are still listening to Joe Rogan in huge numbers, and they'll be more open to criticising, again, whatever their teachers are telling them, whatever their parents are telling them, and they'll be open to alternative narratives, including the narrative of Christianity. And just recently, I mean, it's worth noting this, that Joe Rogan had on his podcast a man called Wesley Huff, who is just a very mainstream evangelical Christian biblical scholar and apologist who did a phenomenal job, I thought, at dealing with Joe Rogan's kind of chaotic conversation, walking with him, and returning again to the factual claims of Christianity, the kinds of things that Jordan Peterson kind of shies away from, but that are important to address online. And it was incredible to see just millions of people engaging with this intelligent, attractive presentation of the central claims of Christianity. And that's not something I would have predicted at all. So Joe Rogan was the number one podcast in the world. And then a few weeks later, he was knocked off the number one by this Rosary podcast that Ascension Presents are producing. So again, extraordinary times to be living in. And so there's this, as we've talked about, and we've got to recognise it, serious decline, serious indifference, and yet these kind of really strange kind of spikes of interest that we should really be attentive to.
Yeah. Now, I was saying to you earlier, my personal opinion, that you can almost look at Jordan Peterson, version 1.0, and then after his sort of near sort of death experience 2.0, and 2.0 seems a bit more anti stuff to me, and almost he's joined this coalition whereby the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and I didn't really feel that at first he had much of an agenda. He was just talking about things that he was passionate about because of his very real experience of of suffering.
Yes.
And where necessary, like I believe there are culture wars going on, but I don't believe in being a culture warrior. I agree that where necessary, I will fight a certain element of the prevailing culture, but I'm first and foremost for something, or actually rather for someone.
Yes, exactly.
I'm for Christ, and therefore I'm not. I might dispute and take on some areas of wokeness.
Mm-hmm.
I might take on some trajectories of contemporary feminism.
Yep.
But I'm not first and foremost against them.
You're not defined by it.
Yeah, and I think Jordan Peterson, although I'm always conscious of just, I only really see what the algorithm shows me, because I don't go intentionally watching that much of his content, but he's got a little bit too much for my liking, sort of just like in a coalition against lots of stuff that he hates. Joe Rogan I haven't listened to as much, but he just seems to me, and I'd be interested in your opinion, like, big grown up frat bro who is just interested in a load of stuff.
Yeah.
And he's got this sort of childish mind, like, but what about that? What about that? Is that a good characterization of him for people who haven't listened? He just seems really interested.
Yeah, I think that's fair. He doesn't necessarily have a rigorous academic training himself, and that's why it was so pleasing to see Wesley Huff on that podcast, because suddenly Joe Rogan was realizing that there is method in the humanities and in thinking about God. Also, there's a method there that and there's a discipline there, and he was walking back some of his earlier claims that he had some people on his podcast making wild claims about certain elements of religion, totally and utterly inaccurate, and you could see him kind of realizing in real time that he shouldn't have done that, and that he should have been a bit more critical. So there's a definite lack of critical thinking there in Joe Rogan. And also, I would say among Gen Z, this is a bit of an issue. We might think again of what G.K. Chesterton said: when people stop believing in God, it's not that they believe in nothing, they'll believe in anything. And so, there's, a huge rise in belief in astrology among that generation as well. So there's all those kinds of things happening. And it's not as if this open-mindedness on the part of young people is just a win for Christianity. I mean, it matters whether they encounter Christ or whether they encounter some less appropriate kind of claims to the truth. Yeah,
I quoted that very line in my word for today on the radio yesterday from Chesterton. And I spoke of the example. There are some people who mock us for our beliefs, and then they'll quite happily go into a shop to buy healing crystals.
Sure, absolutely.
Or tarot cards.
Yeah.
That is like, how then do you as a priest and how as a province and with focus then say, there is this thirst for something more with young people. Where are we intentionally trying to reach them? Because there's some of what happens sort of accidentally, and we're not having to do the groundwork with your Jordan Petersons, your Joe Rogans of this world. It could also be that they encounter sort of Andrew Tate, which he gets tagged along with Jordan Peterson, but I think they're very different fish.
Absolutely.
And if I had a son, I wouldn't mind him watching a lot of Jordan Peterson. If I had a son, I wouldn't want to have him watching a lot of Andrew Tate.
Absolutely.
But how do you go about trying to sort of be in this and get the voice of Christ heard in the culture?
Yeah, and I suppose as Dominicans, it's partly about being available and accepting invitations to go and give talks to groups who are already interested, and to guide them. And I think that's a really important role, and I think it's a really important role for Dominicans to play, because these young people who might also be taking a swing to the right, they might not just be taking in, good, theological ideas, but also some really strange ideas about nationality and race and politics and feminism and so on. They might have some, there might be a healthy critique of feminism, but also there can be a kind of a dose of misogyny in there as well, just through what they're taking in and being formed by. And I think these young people, they're willing to listen to Dominicans. They know that Dominicans represent some kind of a thoughtful tradition in the church, a tradition that that respects truth, that isn't afraid of hard questions, and I think they're willing to listen to Dominicans challenge them, and I think we've got to rise to that challenge, and I think that the challenge for us as priests, when we're dealing with those people who are actually looking for leadership, looking for mentorship, is to provide it, and to show them that the church isn't just a few ideas, but actually right at the heart of the church is a person whom we follow, and that he gives us his Spirit, and that this Spirit enables a particular way of life involving all kinds of physical and spiritual service to the people around us. And so to lead them into that life, to lead them also into the heart of the community, and lead them into the heart of the theological tradition, the social teaching of the church, and so on, just to bring them to, we might say, the Catholic mainstream, and introduce them to all the saints and so on. So I think that's our challenge. It's to kind of to fill out the picture. Very often these young people, they'll have a, let's say, if we imagine kind of a sheet of paper and kind of joining the dots, they might have joined a few of the dots and they've coloured them in very, very brightly. But as priests and as Dominicans, we want them to kind of complete that picture, to join all the dots, and to see the face of Christ emerge, and to live the fullness of the Christian life. I think that's our challenge. Then, in relation to people who aren't actively looking for us, I think we've got to be in the spaces where they're thinking, where they're open to thought, and we've got to be proposing kind of reflection to them. And that can, for example, take the shape of lectures delivered on campus, like through the Thomistic Institute that I'm doing here in London. I'm setting one up in Galway as well. We have our first lecture on Thursday, so people might pray for that there's a response from the young people on the campus in the University of Galway. But I think that that kind of big, wide, generous invitation to people, anybody who's interested in thinking with us, not to be afraid of their questions, not to be afraid of whatever views they might have, including views that we might find unpalatable, not to run away from them, not to be afraid of that, to be patient with these young people, and to propose to them good reading, good things to listen to, and above all, the scriptures.
Yeah. And to get into sort of friendship and how that's sort of operating in Gen Z, where Gen Z, I lapped back. I was doing so well, but they would spend an awful lot of time with earbuds in. Essentially, people sort of connecting with people not with them, and not really connecting with the people with them. But I'm interested in, does a guy watch a video or a clip, and is he sharing it with his friends and talking to them about it, or do they all happen to be simply the algorithm starts presenting them with the same stuff, and then they happen to turn up to the same sort of conference together? How do you see friendship sort of operating and people sort of coming to the church? Because it strikes me what you were saying earlier, that young men really want to lead and to be led, and both of those things don't happen as much as they used to happen. Hence, you get in the area where we live here the rise of gangs replacing fathers who would have previously led their sons in a strong witness of men. But what do you observe of contemporary friendship amongst those who are coming into your circle? Yeah,
and I think there are plenty of lone wolves, plenty of kind of young men who are just exploring these things on their own, maybe not speaking to their friends about them. And I do see, let's say even in the church in Galway, where I minister, I do see an increasing number of young men, especially, who are just turning up on their own. And I don't get talking to many of them afterwards, because you know how difficult it is as a priest outside the church. It's the regulars.
Yeah,
who
one person grabs you.
And you're gone. And you see this person who's been there for the first time. And
it's terrible. And it's like, I see you all the time.
I know. And you don't want to ignore them. Anyway, it's a challenge. But what I've also noticed is little groups of young men who are coming. And they're clearly friends who are kind of... And they're not people who are necessarily practicing. You can see them looking around a little bit, but they're there. They don't know exactly when to kneel, but they're clearly, this is something that's slightly new to them. But they're there as a small group. They're not there because their parents are asking them to be there. And I've experienced this also. I'm thinking of two guys who came to our church in Dublin, and they had scapulars of every colour to be blessed. These were young people. I think they were still in their teens. they were still in secondary school, I think, but they had come to Dublin from a rural town to do a little church crawl. And they had all these scapulars that they had ordered online. Mm-hmm. Their families weren't supportive of them. This was an online thing, but that they shared with each other. Mm. And they were trying their best. They said, none of our friends support us in this, nobody in school, none of our teachers, but it was just the two of these guys. So they had something that they shared. They weren't bitter in any sense. They were really joyful. And I can think of another example when I was speaking in a school, our Dominican school in Kildare, and speaking about science, which is science in the church, was a talk I give in a lot of schools. And these two guys came up afterwards, and one of them had come to Christianity, basically come to a living faith through videos that he'd seen on TikTok. He was also really into MMA, so these kind of two things often go together. A kind of discipline, self-improvement, and then an interest in the spiritual life. But what he had done is he had come to the Dominican friar, who's a chaplain in the school. He had said, can we set up a prayer group? So me and my friend, we listen to all this stuff. We know that prayer is important, but we don't know how to pray. Can we set up a prayer group in the school? And there is now a prayer group in the school through the initiative of these guys. And I think that is something really magnificent. That, again, I wasn't seeing these things happening 10 years ago, but they're happening now. But the starting point is online. But then the question is, how do we form real community, real friendship? I'm just thinking of one other example, because I think you're right about the earbuds. How do we create spaces, kind of more tech-free spaces where there's real encounter, just even between people? We have a summer camp in Cork, in Knockadoon, by the sea, and there, I mean, people willingly disconnect from their devices and actually reconnect with the natural world, the beauty, the sea, and each other, and that does wonders for their spiritual lives. I think also of the Dominicans in Lyon, who have a pub for Catholic university students and their friends, and there again, they're not on their phones, they're drinking wine with each other, they're having long conversations, they've board games, and I think all these are really healthy ways to kind of rehumanize this young generation, which is always going to serve also their relationship with God.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I wanted to ask about liturgy and the experience coming into church, because I had a small argument with somebody online a little while ago. I know that's never happened before, an argument online.
Never.
But it was.
I'm sure it bore lots of fruit, like all these arguments do.
Well, I realised in the end I was right.
Of course.
I'm not sure, which was why I asked the question, because there was somebody saying, who's a very big evangelist in the US, and she was saying, look, Corpus Christi processions are weird and to bystanders outside, and that if ever we're doing a Corpus Christi procession in the streets, then there ought to be people with literature explaining exactly what this is and telling people exactly what the belief is. And I am a little bit more of the view, no, actually, just let the mystery speak for itself. Let them have an experience which poses a question but doesn't necessarily give an answer. But there is also the reality that coming into a Catholic church, if you're not churched, even just where we are here, to preserve the heat, entrances by a side door, which doesn't look that inviting, and you walk into a small vestibule, and then you've got to go through another door which is closed. And a friend of mine who runs a chain of gyms, he said to me, Leeds, your user experience is rubbish.
UX design.
And the evangelicals, like, they would say, no, you need to, and I can see there can be a balance between welcoming people in, but then allowing the liturgy to speak for itself. But do you think we need to explain more of what we're doing in the liturgy? Because it seems to me there do seem to be some people who are attracted by older expressions of the tradition and with the old rite, who don't seem that worried about an explanation. That's a great question. And I would say, I mean, for those young people who are coming from a non-practicing background, even just going to the Novice Ordo Mass, which we grew up with and is totally normal to us, that's already fairly mysterious to them. There's a lot of mysterious gestures and words.
so it's already doing something of what these people are saying the older forms of liturgy do. I think you're absolutely right that we don't need to explain everything. That an experience of kind of the strangeness of public Christian prayer can be a kind of salutary experience for people. I was here in London. Where's St. Anthony's Church? Is that?
There's a few of them.
There's a few of them.
Well, the one out in East London.
Yeah, exactly. So we had a big procession.
St. Jean.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, okay.
So I was there preaching for the Feast of St. Anthony, Forest Gate. Exactly.
Yeah.
I was going to say the New Forest, but I knew Forest was in the title.
There's Dominicans in the New Forest. That's near Southampton.
So Forest Gate, I was invited over to preach for the Feast of St. Anthony, and the procession around the church and through the streets was incredible, and I was so glad to be a part of it. You could see people just looking on, just in absolute amazement at this joyful, incredible presentation. It was such a wonderful representation of London Catholicism, I think, at its best, and it was strange. It was strange to people. I'm sure it would have been strange to your average Muslim or Anglican on the street, but they were fascinated also. And I'm thinking as well of some research that the Church of England did maybe 10 years ago. They were looking at young people who had been baptised in their young adulthood, and what factors had played a part. So was it kind of apologetics? Was it something online? Was it a conversation with a friend? Was it an alpha course? And they found that for something like 20% of them, the key moment that changed everything for them that they identified was actually visiting a big old church and just entering into a space like Durham Cathedral or wherever, and just being stunned by the reality of this dimension of life that had never occurred to them before, but suddenly hits them as kind of real. So I think we should have confidence in the liturgy to do its thing. We don't have to explain it. We don't have to dumb it down constantly. These young people that I know, they love beautiful liturgy celebrated well. And then afterwards, sometimes they have questions, and they'll raise the questions. But what does this mean, and what does that mean, and why do we do that, and so on. And I think that's the way it should happen. It's not that we need to explain everything in the liturgy or have really simple forms of prayer. We can have that too, kind of as ways in and so on. But yeah, I mean, to be at Seek in Cologne, to have a full pontifical mass with the Cardinal Archbishop of Cologne and about 1 million servers. I mean, these young people were in awe of that, and we're just rapt, and I had the sense that it was serving their journey of discovery, and it was serving their love for each other. I mean, it was just a really, really wonderful kind of coming together of all the different elements of the Christian life in that place. Yeah,
to be able to facilitate the experience of awe. For people,
exactly,
is really, really.
And it's rare in our time, I think. Yeah, we're just kind of a cynicism and knowingness all the time, and liturgy can bring us into a different space.
Yeah, there are so many more points that I want to discuss. We didn't get onto Jonathan Pajot, Paul Kingsnorth, Martin Shaw, but I want to close in somebody who we didn't discuss off air, and I wonder whether he sort of impacts on the people you encounter with, who Tom Holland.
Yeah.
Because I was thinking of him because he said Christianity should lean into the weird, and that we've tried to sanitize it too much, but actually it's some of the weirdness that is interesting, and I agree with that. But I think more important is the work he's done as a historian.
Yeah.
And you're a historian as well, about seeing that actually so much of what we love about Christian civilization is rooted in Christ and can't actually be argued for, or wouldn't have come about but for a Judeo-Christian civilization. Is Tom Holland a name in Ireland, and then also like what are you doing with trying to do with your work in studying sort of early Irish Christianity?
Yeah, I think. I mean, first of all, the Rest is History podcast is hugely popular in Ireland as well as elsewhere, and his kind of espousal of Christianity. I mean, he calls himself a Christian now. I think people are aware of that, and I think at least maybe it's a bit more of the kind of the centrist dads who are being reached by Tom Holland rather than the younger generation. I don't think 20-year-olds are all reading Dominion. I think they should be reading Dominion. I don't think they are. But what I'm doing to, partly kind of trying to emulate some of what he's done. on the Irish Dominican YouTube channel, people might be aware of this. There's a series that we have called Treasure Ireland, where we go to all 32 counties in Ireland. That's our plan, and do 10 videos in each county. So it's going to take several years, but we have about 70 videos up there where we visit sites of Christian heritage and tell the story, what happened in this place, what saint was here, what woolen mill was set up by a nun in this place, and so on. And part of what we're trying to do there is just to show that the story of Ireland can't really be told without the gospel at its very heart and Christ at the heart of it all. Not in a polemical way, not in a way that excludes non-Christians and so on, but simply just to kind of tell the story of Ireland and tell local stories, because in Ireland people love local history. They love their place, more so than in England, I think. I mean, in some places in England that's true, I mean, in Yorkshire or whatever, but in Ireland people love, the savage loves his native shore, and people love their local area. They love knowing stories about their local place. And so if you're telling the stories of these saints, or even more modern phenomena and so on, and telling stories of persecution and the faithfulness of the church through times of persecution, I think people are really inspired by this. And when I was out in Seek, at Seek, I was really pleased that some people are allergic to history and have zero interest in history, but there was a group of young guys who had watched a lot of these videos, and we're really into it, and we're really into the history of Christianity. Again, not as a purely academic interest, but as part of their own entering into a tradition, taking up the challenge of being a disciple, being a missionary in their time, and inspired by all these stories of the past. So I think history definitely has a role to play. Shouldn't exaggerate it either. Just because it's something I love doesn't mean it's the answer to the challenges we face. But it definitely has a role to play. And Tom Holland, I think, shows exactly how it can play a role in serving the gospel.
Yeah, I was thinking when you said about obscure Irish saints, there's a wonderful Dominican sister in the community in the New Forest.
Oh, Sister Cooey.
Sister Cooey.
Yeah, I never knew St. Cooey.
No, so I don't think any of the sisters did there when she proposed her religious name either.
No.
But they all went and visited, or some of them were over in Ireland recently and visited the sites associated with the life of
St. Cooey.
Of St. Cooey.
Who knew?
But I think you got to lean into your loves, because you love history, and people will detect your passion, and then through that hopefully encounter your greatest passion.
Yes.
But one of the ways in which you encounter Christ and the way that Christ has transformed lives is through those saints and through history.
Absolutely.
And it's one of the beautiful things about being a Dominican, that you're encouraged to pursue your passions, in the way G.K. Chesterton said, if you study anything hard enough, it'll lead you to God.
Exactly. And I think if we're thinking about how to be online, so we're talking about how, the kind of the big platforms, the Jordan Petersons and the Jonathan Pageaus and so on, but another question, maybe a bit more practical question for each one of us and all of the listeners, is how should we be present online in a way that might lead people to Christ? And I think what you've said there is absolutely spot on, because the challenges that we, one of the risks is that we just talk about the things we hate. So many people do that online. We just talk about the things we hate. I fall into that trap sometimes. But if we spend more time talking about the things we love, and if Christ is kind of there at the heart of the things we love, but so might be, Arsenal or, pints of bitter or whatever else, all these different things we love, I think that will make such a difference online. If Christians are there online, presenting all the beautiful things that they see in the world and that they love and they enjoy, and if our Lord is at the heart of all those things that they love, I think that is bound to have an effect on the people who are in contact with each of us online, so that we all have that missionary challenge online as well, that we're not just there as passive observers. Yeah.
Well, you've spoken about one thing that I love and one thing that I hate there.
Arsenal.
I hate Arsenal, but I love a pint of bitter.
Oh no! I had you down as an Arsenal fan.
But I've loved having this time with you. Thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure, and I'd love to chat to you more, and be assured of our prayers for all the work that you're doing.
Thank you.